They thought I was after his money, but they didn't know I was worth billions. In a dimly lit bank vault, a young black elementary school teacher clutches a stack of documents, tears streaming down her face as she uncovers a truth that flips her world upside down. She's endured snide remarks about her humble roots, condescending smiles dismissing her passion for teaching, and a humiliating prenup that branded her a gold digger, all because of her race and modest life. Yet in this moment, her strength begins to shine through a legacy she never imagined. What happens when the woman they underestimated turns the tables? Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell to catch our latest stories. Drop a comment. Where are you watching from? Stick around to see how her journey unfolds and what shocking secrets await. The aroma of fresh coffee mingled with the faint scent of old books in the cozy, sunlit cafe on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. A young black elementary school teacher sat at a worn wooden table, her red pen dancing across a stack of spelling tests. Her braided hair was pulled into a neat bun, and her eyes sparkled with quiet pride as she scribbled encouraging notes for her third graders. Teaching wasn't just a job, it was her calling, a chance to light up young minds in a world that often dimmed their shine. She wore a simple cardigan over a floral dress, her modest attire reflecting a life built on meaning rather than money. Yet beneath her calm exterior, a flicker of longing stirred. She dreamed of a love that saw her for who she was, not where she came from. Across the cafe, a man in a tailored navy suit chuckled at his phone, his warm brown eyes crinkling with amusement. His laugh, rich and unself-conscious, cut through the soft hum of conversation, drawing her gaze. He caught her looking and flashed a sheepish grin. "Sorry, my friend sent me a terrible joke. I'm dying over here." His voice was smooth, confident, but not arrogant, a rare blend that made her smile back. "I'm James," he said, extending a hand. She hesitated, then shook it, her fingers brushing against his. "Nice to meet you," she replied, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. That brief exchange sparked something neither expected. For 2 hours, they talked as if the world outside had paused. James, an investment banker from a world of glass towers and seven-figure deals, listened intently as she shared stories of her classroom, tales of a shy student mastering a math problem, or the chaos of a science fair gone awry. He didn't talk over her or flaunt his wealth. Instead, he asked questions, laughed at her anecdotes, and seemed genuinely captivated by her passion. She, in turn, was drawn to his easy charm, the way he spoke about his work with purpose but never pretension. By the time they parted, numbers exchanged, she felt a warmth she hadn't known in years. Over the next 6 months, their connection deepened. James became a fixture in her life, showing up after school with her favorite latte, his sleek car parked incongruously among the teacher's beat-up sedans. He'd roll up his expensive sleeves and help her hang student artwork, his laughter echoing in the classroom as he struggled with a stapler. On weekends, they strolled through city parks, sharing dreams and fears under the shade of ancient oaks. She told him about her childhood, raised by a single mother who worked long hours as a nurse, instilling in her a fierce pride in her roots. James listened, nodding, but occasionally his comments carried a subtle edge. "Your neighborhood sounds lively," he'd say, his tone betraying surprise that she thrived in a place he'd never dared visit. Or, with a teasing smile, "You're not like any teacher I've met. You've got this spark." The words felt like compliments, but they stung, hinting that her blackness, her ordinary life, made her an exception to some unspoken rule. Still, she brushed it off, chalking it up to his unfamiliarity with her world. Love, she told herself, would bridge the gap. But her mother saw things differently. One evening, as they sat at the worn kitchen table in her modest apartment, her mother's eyes, lined with years of hard-won wisdom, fixed on her. "Baby, men like him, rich, polished, they don't always let their hearts lead," she said, her voice low but firm. "And their families, they'll chew you up if you don't fit their mold." Her mother's words carried the weight of experience, memories of slights and struggles as a black woman in a world quick to judge. She stirred her tea, her gaze piercing. "You're walking into a lion's den, and I'm scared you'll get hurt." The teacher bristled, her fork clinking against her plate. "You don't know him, Mama. He's different. He sees me." Her voice rose, sharp with defiance. "Not every rich man is out to control me, And not every family is like that. You're being cynical. Her mother sighed, her shoulders slumping. I'm not saying he's bad, but love doesn't erase the world they live in. Just be careful. The air grew heavy, their words hanging like a storm cloud. She left that night, her heart torn between her mother's warning and her faith in James. She wanted to believe in a love that could conquer all, but a seed of doubt had been planted. That doubt sprouted when she received an invitation to dinner at James's family home. She spent hours preparing, choosing a simple but elegant dress, and practicing polite responses in the mirror. She wanted to make a good impression, to prove she belonged at his side. As James drove her through winding suburban roads, the houses grew larger, their manicured lawns a stark contrast to the cramped streets of her childhood. His hand rested on hers, but his silence felt heavy, as if he, too, sensed the trial ahead. The family's colonial mansion loomed like a monument, its marble steps gleaming under the evening light. Inside, crystal chandeliers cast a cold glow over polished floors. James's mother, a retired judge with silver-streaked hair and a commanding presence, greeted her with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You must be the teacher James speaks of," she said, her tone clipped, the word teacher carrying a faint sneer. His father, a quiet man with a practiced nod, shook her hand, but his gaze flickered to his wife, as if awaiting her lead. The dinner table was set with fine china, the air thick with unspoken judgment. As the meal progressed, the teacher felt the weight of their scrutiny. James's mother asked about her work, but her questions were laced with condescension. "Teaching must be so fulfilling. Spiritually, I mean. The pay can't be much, but I suppose the hours are nice." The words landed like a slap, implying her career was a charity case, her life less valuable. James's sister, a poised woman in designer heels, chimed in. "It's so noble, working with those kids in challenging areas." The phrase "those kids" dripped with assumption, a coded reference to the mostly black and brown students she taught. The teacher forced a smile, her fork trembling slightly as she speared a piece of asparagus. She shared a story about a student's breakthrough in reading, hoping to shift the tone. But the family's polite nods felt dismissive, their eyes glazing over. James tried to defend her, his voice soft but firm. "She's incredible with her students. You should see how they light up around her." But his mother's tight smile silenced him, and he retreated, his hand brushing hers under the table, as if to apologize. The gesture felt hollow. She caught his father glancing at his wife, reading her cues, and realized James was no match for the family's unspoken rules. The dinner stretched on, each comment a subtle jab at her modest background, her race woven into their assumptions like a shadow they refused to name. "It's so refreshing to meet someone so grounded," his mother said, her eyes lingering on her dark skin, as if her very presence was an anomaly in their world. As the city lights blurred past the car window, the young black teacher clung to the hope that James's love would outweigh the sting of his family's judgment. His promise, "They'll come around," echoed in her mind, but the weight of the evening pressed against her chest, a quiet warning that love might not be enough. She stared into the night, her reflection flickering in the glass, and wondered if she could truly belong in his world. The invitation to dinner at his family's home loomed ahead, a test she wasn't sure she could pass. The following weekend, she stood before her mirror, smoothing the folds of a navy dress she'd spent hours choosing. Elegant, but understated, a careful balance to signal she belonged without trying too hard. Her heart raced as she applied a touch of lipstick, her mother's words from their last conversation ringing in her ears. "You're walking into a lion's den." She pushed the thought aside, determined to prove her wrong. James picked her up, his smile warm but tinged with nervous energy. As they drove through the suburbs, the houses grew grander, their manicured lawns stretching like silent sentinels. The colonial mansion came into view, its marble steps gleaming under the twilight, a monument to wealth and exclusion. She took a deep breath, clutching her purse, and stepped out of the car, feeling like a guest in a world that didn't want her. Inside, the air was cool, scented with polished wood and faint lavender. Crystal chandeliers cast sharp light across a foyer that could swallow her modest apartment whole. James's mother, a retired judge with silver-streaked hair pulled into a severe bun, emerged from a hallway. Her tailored blazer and pearl necklace screamed authority, but her smile was a thin veneer, never reaching her steel-gray eyes. "You must be the teacher James speaks of," she said, her voice crisp, the word teacher landing like a subtle jab. The young woman extended her hand, her smile polite but guarded. "It's a pleasure to meet you," she replied, her tone steady despite the flutter in her stomach. James's father, a lean man with a reserved demeanor, offered a nod and a handshake, his eyes flicking to his wife as if seeking her approval. They moved to the dining room where a mahogany table gleamed under the weight of fine china and silver cutlery. James's sister, a poised woman in her early 30s, sat across from them, her designer dress catching the light. The table was set for formality, not warmth, and the young teacher felt every inch of the distance between her world and theirs. As they sat, James squeezed her hand under the table, a silent reassurance, but his eyes darted nervously to his mother. The meal began with a clink of glasses, the family's polished manners a stark contrast to the lively chaos of her own family dinners, where laughter and stories flowed freely. The conversation started innocently enough, with James's father asking about her work. "Teaching third grade must be rewarding," he said, his tone neutral but curious. She seized the chance to share her passion, describing a student who'd beam with pride after reading his first book aloud. "It's moments like that that make it all worth it," she said, her voice warm with conviction. But his mother's lips pursed slightly, and she leaned forward, her fork poised. "It must be so fulfilling spiritually, I mean. The pay can't be much, but I suppose the hours are manageable." The words were cloaked in politeness, but they cut deep, implying her career was a noble sacrifice, not a profession. The young woman's smile tightened, her fingers gripping her napkin. "I love what I do," she said simply, hoping to steer the conversation elsewhere. James's sister chimed in, her voice dripping with condescension. "It's so noble, working with those kids in challenging areas." The phrase "those kids" hung in the air, a coded reference to the mostly black and brown students she taught. The teacher's jaw clenched, but she forced a nod, refusing to let them see her flinch. "Every child deserves someone who believes in them," she replied, her tone measured but firm. The sister's smile was patronizing, as if she just praised a child for effort. James shifted uncomfortably, his hand brushing hers again, but he said nothing, his silence louder than any words. The mother steered the conversation to James's work, praising his latest deal with a pride that bordered on possessive. "He's always been destined for greatness," she said, her eyes sliding to the teacher, as if to measure her worth against his. "It takes discipline to thrive in his world." The implication was clear. Her world, her classroom, her modest life was lesser. She tried to contribute, mentioning a community project her students were working on, but the mother's response was a curt nod, her attention already elsewhere. "It's so refreshing to meet someone so grounded," she said, her gaze lingering on the teacher's dark skin. The word grounded carrying a weight that felt like a judgment on her race and class. James tried to bridge the gap, his voice soft but earnest. "She's incredible with her students. You should see how they light up around her." But his mother's tight smile silenced him, her eyes narrowing slightly as if his defense was a betrayal. The teacher felt the room closing in, each comment a subtle jab at her modest background, her blackness a shadow they refused to name. The father, sensing the tension, asked about her family, but even his question felt loaded. "It must be quite a change, coming from where you're from," he said, his pause heavy with assumption. She swallowed the urge to snap back, instead offering a brief story about her mother's resilience as a nurse. The table fell silent, their polite nods masking disinterest. As the meal dragged on, the teacher felt like an outsider in a play where everyone knew their lines but her. The family's questions grew sharper, each one a test she couldn't pass. "Do you ever think about a more stable career?" the sister asked, her tone suggesting teaching was a hobby, not a calling. The mother added, "It's admirable to choose such a path, but it must be hard to keep up in today's world." The subtext was unmistakable. Her life, her choices, her very existence didn't measure up to their standards. She forced a smile, her fork trembling as she speared a piece of roasted potato, her appetite gone. James's attempts to defend her grew weaker, his voice fading under his mother's gaze. "She's making a real difference," he said at one point, but the words felt hollow, his hand no longer reaching for hers. She caught his father glancing at his wife, reading her cues, and realized James was no match for the family's unspoken rules. The dinner stretched into an eternity, each course a reminder of her place, or lack thereof, in their world. When dessert arrived, a delicate souffle she barely touched, the mother's final comment landed like a blow. "It's so inspiring to see someone make the most of their circumstances," she said, her eyes cold, as if her very presence was a charity they tolerated. The city lights faded into the distance as the young black teacher stared out the car window. James's words, "They're just set in their ways," ringing hollow against the sting of his family's judgment. The memory of their cold smiles and veiled insults clung to her like a shadow, making her question if love could truly bridge the chasm between their worlds. Yet in her heart, a stubborn spark of hope flickered, urging her to hold on to James, to believe he saw her for who she was. That hope carried her forward, through weeks of stolen moments and quiet reassurances, until a single morning changed everything. It was a crisp Saturday, the air alive with the scent of blooming jasmine, when James led her to the park where they had shared their first date. The old oak trees stood sentinel, their branches swaying gently as sunlight dappled the grass. He stopped near a wooden bench, his hands fidgeting, a nervous smile playing on his lips. Her heart quickened, sensing something momentous. Then with a deep breath, he dropped to one knee, a velvet box in his hand, revealing a diamond that caught the light like a star. "Will you marry me?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Her breath caught, tears welling as she nodded, unable to speak. She threw her arms around him, the world narrowing to the warmth of his embrace, the promise of a shared future. For those fleeting moments, the doubts from that disastrous dinner melted away, and she felt like she was living in a dream. They spent the day wrapped in joy, laughing over picnic sandwiches and planning a life together. She imagined a small wedding, filled with her students' handmade decorations and her mother's proud smile. But as evening fell, James suggested they share the news with his parents. Her stomach tightened, the memory of their last encounter flashing like a warning. Still, she agreed, clinging to the belief that their engagement might soften their hearts. They drove to the colonial mansion, its imposing silhouette no less daunting in the twilight. As they stepped inside, the familiar chill of the foyer greeted her, the crystal chandeliers casting their cold light. James's mother emerged, her expression unreadable, while his father offered a polite nod. The teacher's ring sparkled on her finger, a symbol of hope she held tightly. They sat in the formal living room, the air heavy with anticipation. James, his arm around her, announced their engagement with a proud smile. "We're getting married," he said, his voice steady but eager. She waited for congratulations, for warmth, but instead his mother's lips pressed into a thin line. "Well," she said, her tone clipped, "I suppose we'll need to discuss a prenup." The words landed like a slap, stripping the joy from the moment. The teacher's smile faltered, her fingers curling around the edge of the couch. James shifted uncomfortably, his hand tightening on hers. "Mom, can we at least celebrate first?" he asked, his voice tinged with frustration. But his mother's gaze remained fixed on her, cold and calculating, as if she were a problem to be solved. The room grew stifling, the weight of her stare unbearable. "It's just a formality," his mother continued, her voice smooth but unyielding. "James has worked so hard to build his career, his future. We need to protect that." The implication was clear. She, with her modest teaching job and black heritage, was a threat to their legacy. The teacher's chest tightened, her mind racing back to her mother's warning about the lion's den. She glanced at James, hoping he'd push back, but his eyes dropped to the floor, his silence a betrayal that cut deeper than words. His father cleared his throat, offering a week. "It's standard practice," but his words did little to soften the blow. That night James drove her home, the car filled with a tense quiet. "It's just paperwork," he said, his voice soft, almost pleading. "It doesn't change how I feel about you." She nodded, her throat too tight to respond, but the words felt empty. The prenup wasn't just paperwork. It was a declaration that she didn't belong, that her love was suspect. Sleep eluded her that night, her mind replaying his mother's cold eyes, the way James had let the moment pass without a fight. She wanted to believe in him, in them, but the doubt that had sprouted at that first dinner now bloomed into something she couldn't ignore. Days later, a sleek black car arrived at her apartment, sent by James's mother. The driver handed her an invitation to meet at their family lawyer's office downtown. Her heart sank, but she dressed carefully, choosing a simple blazer and skirt, determined to face whatever came with dignity. The office was all glass and steel, a stark contrast to her cozy classroom. James was there, his expression strained, alongside his mother and a stern-faced lawyer in a pinstripe suit. The prenup was laid out on the polished table, a stack of papers that felt heavier than stone. The lawyer's voice was clinical as he outlined the terms. She would have no claim to James's assets, regardless of how long they were married. If they divorced, she'd receive minimal alimony for just 2 years. And if she ever tarnished the family's reputation, she'd walk away with nothing. Each clause was a dagger, crafted to remind her of her place, outside their world. James's mother watched her closely, her lips curved in a satisfied smile that didn't reach her eyes. "This is for everyone's protection," she said, her tone dripping with false concern. "Given your circumstances, I'm sure you understand." The word circumstances was a coded jab, a nod to her race and modest background, implying she was a gold digger who needed to be contained. The teacher's hands trembled as she held the pen, her eyes scanning the document. She looked to James, searching for the man who'd knelt in the park, but he only offered a weak, "It's standard, babe. It doesn't mean anything." His words were a lifeline she wanted to grasp, but they felt like sand slipping through her fingers. The room seemed to close in, the lawyer's monotone voice fading into a hum. She thought of her mother, of the pride she'd instilled in her, of the classroom where she felt whole. Signing this document meant accepting their judgment, their belief that she was less than. But refusing meant risking the love she'd fought for, the future she'd dreamed of. Her heart pounded, torn between defiance and devotion. She closed her eyes, a single tear escaping, and pressed the pen to the paper. Her signature was shaky, each stroke a surrender she hated herself for. James's mother's smile widened, a silent victory, while James looked away, his jaw tight. The lawyer gathered the papers with a nod, as if sealing her fate. As they left the office, the teacher felt a hollowness she couldn't name. James walked beside her, his hand hovering near hers but not touching, as if he sensed the rift growing between them. "We're still us," he said, his voice low. But she couldn't meet his eyes. The prenup wasn't just a contract, it was a wall, built to keep her out, to remind her she'd never be enough. She thought of her mother's warning, the lion's den she'd dismissed, and felt a pang of regret. Had she been naive to think love could conquer this? The elevator doors closed with a soft thud, sealing the young black teacher in a moment of suffocating clarity. Her signature on the prenup had carved a wound deeper than she'd expected, and James's silence had left her questioning everything. As the city lights glimmered below, a distant promise of hope, she felt the weight of her sacrifice settle like a stone in her chest. The love she'd clung to now felt like a fragile thread, fraying under the pressure of a world that saw her as less than. Weeks passed in a haze of routine, grading papers, teaching her third graders, forcing smiles for James. But the ache of that day lingered, a quiet reminder of her mother's warning. Then a single phone call shattered her world, pulling her into a truth she never could have imagined. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the classroom still humming with the energy of her students' laughter, when her phone buzzed with a call from the hospital. Her father, the steady, unassuming man who'd raised her alone, had collapsed at work from a sudden heart attack. Her heart plummeted as she rushed to the hospital, the world blurring past in a frantic drive. The sterile white walls of the ICU closed in around her as she sat by his bedside, his hand frail in hers. He was her rock, the man who'd taught her to tie her shoes, who'd cheered at every school play, who'd worked long hours at what she thought was a modest office job to keep their small apartment warm. His breathing was shallow, his eyes heavy with pain, but he managed a weak smile. "Baby girl," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "When this is over, go to the bank. Safety deposit box. Everything you need is there." His words hung in the air, cryptic and urgent, before his grip softened and he slipped into a restless sleep. For 3 days, she barely left his side, her world narrowing to the beep of monitors and the weight of his hand in hers. James was there, bringing coffee and holding her when she broke down, his presence a flicker of the man she'd fallen for. But her focus was on her father, the man who'd taught her to stand tall despite the world's judgments. On the third day, as rain streaked the hospital windows, he squeezed her hand one last time, his eyes locking onto hers. "You're stronger than you know," he murmured, then closed his eyes forever. The loss hit like a tidal wave, grief swallowing her whole. She clung to James as she wept, her world unmoored, unaware that her father's final words would soon rewrite her story. The funeral was small, held in a modest chapel filled with neighbors, co-workers, and a few of her fellow teachers. James stood by her side, his arm around her as she delivered a trembling eulogy, speaking of her father's quiet strength, his love for jazz, his knack for fixing anything with a screwdriver, and a smile. The mourners nodded, their faces warm with shared memories, but she felt a hollowness no words could fill. After the service, as she stood by his grave, the weight of his last instruction pressed against her. "Safety deposit box," he'd said. The words felt like a puzzle, a final gift from a man who'd always surprised her with his wisdom. She resolved to honor his wish, even as grief clouded her every step. A week later, a call came from a lawyer named Mr. Thompson, his voice calm but insistent. "I was your father's attorney for over 20 years, he said. "We need to meet about his estate." She almost laughed, the idea of an estate absurd. Her father drove a beat-up sedan, lived in a rented apartment, and bought her thrift store books for her birthday. What estate could he possibly have? But curiosity and a need to feel close to him drove her to the lawyer's office in a nondescript building downtown. Mr. Thompson, a gray-haired man with kind eyes, handed her a small brass key. "Your father was clear," he said. "Open the safety deposit box alone. Read everything inside, then we'll talk." His tone carried a weight that made her pulse quicken, as if he knew something she didn't. The bank was an imposing structure, its marble columns towering over the bustling street. She clutched the key, her palms sweaty, as a clerk led her to a vault deep within the building. The safety deposit box was larger than she'd expected, its metal surface cold under her fingers. She opened it with trembling hands, her breath catching as she peered inside. A stack of documents, photographs, and a single handwritten letter stared back at her, each item a piece of a life she'd never known. Her fingers brushed a yellowed newspaper clipping from decades ago. The headline bold, "Local tech entrepreneur sells startup for $2.8 billion. The grainy photo showed her father, younger, sharper, shaking hands with suited executives. Her heart stopped. This couldn't be right. She sank to the floor of the vault, papers spilling around her as she read. More clippings detailed his rise as a tech pioneer, a black man who'd built a software company that revolutionized financial systems. Stock certificates, bank statements, and investment records painted a picture of staggering wealth. Nearly $3 billion, carefully managed and hidden. Photographs showed him at charity galas, shaking hands with CEOs, his smile reserved but proud. A letter written in his familiar scrawl explained it all. "I wanted you to grow up knowing your worth isn't tied to money," he wrote. "I lived simply so you could be strong, grounded, free from the weight of wealth. But you're ready now, baby girl. Use this to make a difference." Her hands shook as she read, tears blurring the words. Her father, the man who'd patched her jeans and cooked her pancakes, was one of the first black billionaires in America. She spent hours in that vault, piecing together his secret life. He'd sold his company in his 30s, amassing a fortune he'd never flaunted. Instead, he'd funneled it into scholarships, community centers, and educational programs, all while raising her to value hard work and humility. The documents revealed his own battles, investors who doubted him because of his race, partners who tried to undermine him. He'd chosen anonymity to protect her, to shield her from a world that judged them both too harshly. She clutched the letter to her chest, her grief mingling with awe. He'd given her a normal life, but now he'd left her a legacy that could change everything. When she finally met with Mr. Thompson, her mind was reeling. He explained the details calmly. After taxes and her father's ongoing charitable commitments, she'd inherited just over $2 billion in liquid assets, real estate, and investments. The numbers were incomprehensible, a fortune that dwarfed the world she'd known. She thought of the prenup, of James's mother's smug smile, of the assumptions that had diminished her. For the first time, she felt a spark of power, not from the money but from the truth her father had hidden. He'd seen her worth all along, and now she was beginning to see it too. The city bustled around the young black teacher as she left the lawyer's office, the brass key to her father's safety deposit box heavy in her pocket, her mind reeling from the revelation of his hidden billions. She carried a new strength, not from the wealth itself, but from the truth her father had entrusted to her. A legacy of resilience that challenged everything she'd endured. The prenup, James's mother's smug smile, the weight of their judgment, all of it seemed smaller now, dwarfed by the realization that her worth had never been tied to their world. Yet the pain of James's silence lingered, and she knew the true test of her newfound power was still to come. She steeled herself for the next family dinner, determined to face the lions in their den and reclaim her dignity. The invitation came swiftly, a formal card from James's mother requesting her presence at another gathering at their colonial mansion. She sensed an opportunity, not for reconciliation, but for truth. She dressed carefully, choosing a tailored black dress that spoke of quiet confidence, her father's letter tucked into her purse like a talisman. As James drove her to the suburbs, his usual warmth was muted, his hands tight on the wheel. The mansion loomed as imposing as ever, its marble steps gleaming under the evening sky. Inside, the dining room was set for a crowd. James's parents, his sister, and a handful of their polished friends, all gathered around the mahogany table under the cold glow of chandeliers. The air crackled with expectation, though none of them knew the storm she was about to unleash. Dinner began with the usual formalities, the clink of crystal glasses and polite chatter about investments and charity galas. James's mother, her silver hair immaculate, greeted her with a smile that felt more like a challenge. "It's lovely to have you back," she said, her tone laced with condescension, as if her presence was a favor. The teacher nodded, her own smile calm but unyielding, her father's words echoing in her mind. "Your worth isn't tied to money." She bided her time, letting the conversation flow, their voices a hum of privilege she no longer envied. James sat beside her, his hand brushing hers under the table, but his eyes darted nervously, as if he sensed a shift in her. The moment came during dessert, as the guests sipped coffee and James's mother launched into another veiled jab. "It's so admirable how you manage with such a demanding job," she said, her eyes lingering on her with false sympathy. "I'm sure it's rewarding, even if it's not lucrative." The table murmured agreement, their smiles patronizing. The teacher set down her fork, her heart steady, and reached into her purse. "Actually," she said, her voice clear and deliberate, "I've recently come into some family business that might interest you." She placed a folder of bank statements and documents on the table, the numbers stark and undeniable. $2 billion in assets, inherited from her father, a tech titan they'd never suspected. The room fell silent, the air thick with shock. James's mother's face drained of color, her coffee cup trembling in her hand. His father choked on a sip of wine, his eyes wide as he scanned the figures. James stared at the documents, his mouth slightly open, as if seeing her for the first time. The guests exchanged glances, their polished facades crumbling. "There must be some mistake," his mother stammered, her voice thin. "These numbers can't be right." The teacher met her gaze, unflinching. "They're quite right," she said calmly. "My father was a founder of a tech empire. Perhaps you've heard of him." She slid a newspaper clipping across the table, the headline proclaiming her father's billion-dollar deal. The silence deepened, a deafening acknowledgement of their misjudgment. James's mother recovered quickly, her tone shifting to forced warmth. "What an extraordinary man your father must have been," she said, her smile brittle. "Such foresight." His father jumped in, asking eager questions about the company, as if they'd been allies all along. His sister, usually aloof, leaned forward, her voice suddenly friendly. "We should connect sometime. Maybe lunch?" The hypocrisy was palpable. Their sudden respect was tied not to her, but to her wealth. The teacher watched them, her heart steady, seeing their true colors laid bare. They didn't value her. They valued her bank account. James, however, was different. His face wasn't lit with awe or greed, but with shame. His eyes avoided hers, his shoulders slumped as if the weight of his silence during the prenup signing pressed down on him. "Why didn't you tell me?" he whispered later as they stood in the foyer. "I could have stopped this." She looked at him, her voice soft but firm. "I needed to know if you'd stand by me when I had nothing." His silence confirmed what she'd feared. He hadn't fought for her then, and he couldn't face her now. The realization was a quiet ache, the final crack in a love she'd once believed in. The drive home was a funeral for their relationship. James tried to speak, promising to make things right, but his words felt hollow, unable to bridge the chasm between them. She returned his ring, her fingers steady as she placed it in his palm. "The man I loved would have fought for me," she said, her voice breaking but resolute. "Not for my money, but for me." She kept the prenup, not out of bitterness, but as a reminder of her worth. A lesson her father had taught her, sealed in that safety deposit box. As she stepped out of his car, the night air cool against her skin, she felt a weight lift, replaced by a clarity that burned brighter than her pain. She drove to her mother's apartment, the familiar warmth of the small space, a stark contrast to the mansion's cold grandeur. Her mother opened the door, her eyes soft with understanding. The teacher fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "You were right," she sobbed. "I should have listened." Her mother knelt beside her, pulling her into a fierce embrace. "You're here now, baby," she said, her voice a balm. "That's what matters. No blame, no judgment, just love, unconditional and unwavering." In that moment, the wounds of betrayal began to heal, her mother's arms a safe harbor where she could rebuild. From that day, she charted a new path. She founded a foundation in her father's name, pouring his wealth into schools and programs for underserved children, her passion for teaching now a mission to empower. She built a school where she taught, standing at the front of a classroom she designed, surrounded by kids whose dreams she nurtured. One evening, in the mundane glow of a grocery store checkout line, she met a social worker, a man with kind eyes and a laugh that warmed her soul. He knew nothing of her fortune, only the spark in her smile, and that was enough. Their connection grew, rooted in mutual respect, a love untainted by wealth or status. As she stood in the school's courtyard, his hand in hers, children's laughter ringing around them, her father's words echoed, "Your worth isn't tied to money." She'd faced the lions, reclaimed her strength, and found a love that saw her for who she was. The city skyline glowed in the distance, a testament to her rebirth, her heart finally free. What a journey we've shared through this story of resilience, love, and self-discovery. The young teacher's triumph over prejudice and her embrace of her true worth remind us all to stand tall, no matter the odds. Have you ever faced a moment where you had to prove your value against others' doubts? Or maybe you've learned a lesson about love and respect that changed your path? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and share your story. Where are you watching from? Your voice matters, and we're grateful for every moment you spend with us. Thank you for joining this heartfelt ride. Your support keeps these stories alive. Hit that subscribe button to catch our next tale, and we'll see you soon for another journey that inspires and uplifts. Until then, keep shining, because your worth is more than anyone's judgment.